Wes and Andrew. I met Andrew, actually, I don't know how I met Andrew, come to think of it, but he seems to know everyone, right? So, but I count it as as really a gift to me that I had a chance to meet Andrew, and that he was willing to engage me in what. So when I first met Andrew, he said, "Man, this matrix is great. You don't realize how many people are using it within this community." And I had no idea. Honestly, I had zero idea how, one, big this community is, and two, just that you guys have put it to use in really interesting and fascinating ways. So I am blessed by being here. I'm blessed by hearing stories from you guys about how you put it to use. And if you haven't put it to use yet, well, hang on tight. I'm going to give you, hopefully, a lot of good nuggets that you can use to take back into your businesses, into your customers and clients. I had a chance to talk to a lot of folks. As you know, I've been signing books, but what I've been asking you is, have you put it to use? Tell me the stories of how you put it to use. Tell me the stories of what you've learned, because I learned from that too. And at some point, maybe if there's a volume 2 of this book, I'll have you contribute a chapter, right, about telling the story of what you've done with the Matrix. Also, Andrew asked me last week, I think it was, hey, can you send me your slides? I told him, yeah, I'll get to it. But part of the reason why I didn't get him his slides is because I had many conversations with you all where I heard your problems. And I heard, gee, I wish I could use the matrix to do X or Y or Z. So I incorporated as many of those stories or those requests into this briefing. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few. And so I'm going to save time at the end for you guys to ask questions. And I can virtually assure you, I'll give you, I don't know, 500,000 dictator coins if you stump me with a question or a problem that I don't have a slide for. Okay? I have a lot of slides. And it's not in this particular briefing, but it'll be in my collection of briefings that I have. So yeah, I'll take any questions or any thoughts about anything I might have missed that addresses a problem that you have. And the book itself, which Blackpoint was very kind to be able to sponsor. So if you haven't visited their booth and picked up a book, please go and do so. I really don't want to take that much luggage back home. So yeah, grab a book. And I'm happy to sign it and to give a note as well. But anyway, my point is that it's great to be here. And I hope that you guys learn something new. And more importantly, apply it. And then teach other people about it as well. Okay? All right. So let me give you some context behind how I came up with the matrix to begin with. So when I was at Bank of America, so right now I'm the CISO at JupiterOne. This is the logo for it, which I like because it kind of looks like the Death Star. I don't know, but it's not the Death Star. Anyway, it's Jupiter. But before JupiterOne, I was the chief security scientist at Bank of America. And one of my challenges, my remit was to design the security strategy, the technology security strategy for Bank of America. You know, pretty large organization. But the challenge I had was the first thing I saw in the marketplace, and just even in our own portfolio, was this blur of all these buzzwords. And trying to dissect this and trying to find the gaps in this is really hard, right? If I asked you just real quickly, what gaps do I have here? What am I missing? You'd have a hard time telling me what's missing. So I needed a better way. And the better way was to basically say, what if I could find a way to organize this into something more coherent? And so the coherent aspect of it is then using these two dimensions, things that I care about, things that I do. And when I can organize those into these two dimensions, I get what you know as the cyber defense matrix. Now, it's a simple mental model, right? Bingo card, 5 by 5. But you also notice the thing on the bottom, this degree of dependency on people, process, and technology. And arguably, that's one of the more fascinating and interesting aspects of the matrix, which we'll get into a little later. But again, it's a real simple construct, right? And the goal here, for me, was to test this matrix and see how I can break it, right? So, you know, if I'm a chief security scientist, a scientist takes a scientific approach, you propose a theory or model, then you proceed to try to break it, to falsify it. So one way to falsify it is to say, okay, well, I had all those buzzwords. can I now organize them into something that fits into this matrix? And lo and behold, for the most part, I could. Now, I couldn't do it for everything. There were places it definitely broke. And so I had to wrestle with that and figure out, OK, how do I make this work for myself, for other organizations? And that's really the challenge I'm throwing out to you guys as well. Please break this model, OK? Because as you break it, we'll discover really interesting ways to make it better and understand the environment that we're in. And that's what science is all about, right? To make our lives better. And to understand the complex situation that we're in. Now, it's important for us to recognize that inside of each of these boxes are capabilities. These aren't vendors, right? These are capabilities that you can potentially deliver to your customers and clients. And of course, back behind this is a bunch of vendors. And this is our typical way that we see the market. We see flashy logos and they have these buzzwords that they throw at us. But essentially, when we think about how we sell to our customers and clients, we're really framing it in the context of, go get this product, go get this software, go get this technology. But I did want to make sure that you understood what we really want to think about is from the context of the underlying capability that makes up these technologies. Because just knowing that you have a technology doesn't really help you understand what you're delivering. What we really want to understand is the fundamental capability that undergirds these technologies. And I'll go over that in greater detail later. Now, I'm only going to give you a handful of use cases today, some of which are covered in the book and some of which are not covered in the book. But if you do actually want to see all the other use cases, I do have them publicly available as well. The first one, when I gave this talk in 2016, which I think I can say this. I think that I'm looking over at Patrick Beggs over here, who we were colleagues at the time. And I don't know if Patrick knows this, but I almost got fired. Yes, anyway. I gave this talk without prior approval from the powers that be. And I found out after I gave the talk that I was not allowed, I was not approved to give this talk. I was told after that. And my boss at the time was specifically instructed me afterwards, which, anyway, you get the idea. But my original use case for, oops, what happened there? My original use case for this was what you saw previously, the vendor map. And with the mapping, though, I discovered, OK, well, after I did the mapping, I said, you know what, there's all these other really cool things we can do with it. And so I found all these other use cases, and these use cases are described in this first briefing. 3 years later, I gave this, oops, what's going on here? 3 years later, I gave this talk in 2019, Cyber Defense Matrix Reloaded, and came up with a whole bunch of other use cases here as well. Many of which, again, are captured in the briefings, but I just wouldn't have time to cover all of these. And then 3 years later, so 2019, 2022, well, I was supposed to be in San Francisco this week, but Andrew was able to somehow convince the RSA community to move it to June. So that's why I'm able to join you today. All right. OK, so if you want more content about the Cyber Defense Matrix, or if you ever want to hear more about the other use cases, definitely reach out to me, and I'm happy to share the details of that. So now let me jump into the matrix and give you some more context behind how it works. So the first aspect is really just understanding left and right of boom. So again, John, thank you for sponsoring the book, but your definition of right and boom are not correct. Or at least it's slightly off. Okay. So boom happens between protect and detect. Okay. If there isn't a boom, there's nothing to detect, right? So boom occurs between protect and detect. On the left of boom, we want to understand the state of our environment, what I call structural awareness. This is things like what assets do I have? Are they built to code? What are the relationships between those assets? What are the vulnerabilities? That's all left of boom. Okay? Vulnerability scanning, vulnerability discovery, left of boom. structural weaknesses left of boom. On the right side of boom, you want to understand, has a vulnerability been exploited? Has something happened? And I want to systematically discover that and then eradicate it or basically address it and then get back into normal operations. By the way, one other tip I would offer, if you ever wanted to really challenge yourself, and feel free to, well, I don't know if I have a jar, but I will actually try, you will hear me explicitly try to avoid using the words identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It's because we oftentimes do not mean the same thing when we say those words. So I will try to describe those words instead of actually using those words. But if you catch me using those words accidentally or too loosely, then I'll owe you some dictator points. All right, so first is just, again, understanding left and right of boom. And this really helps us in one particular capacity around the degree of dependency on the bottom, which is there's a shift from depending upon technology on the left of boom to depending more on people on the right of boom. And I think this has a fundamental, there's a huge implication for that shift when it comes to the kind of services or the kind of technologies that you guys deliver, okay? I would love for people to try to disprove me on that degree of dependency spectrum. So far, there's a lot of people who say, you know what, I'm sure we can get more technology to do the work on the right side. I too would love to see that happen. But time and time again, I've seen firsthand and have heard from many others who basically say, I wished technology would do more. Even the people who are building the technology, the startups that are basically in that space, are finding that this particular degree of dependency, as it diminishes on the right, remains true. If you want to read, if you want to even see a scientific article on this, read this paper called The Ironies of Automation. The Ironies of Automation, which basically says, despite how much we try to automate things, we still actually increase our dependency on people. And that's what we're seeing on the right side. All right, so now the matrix fundamentally is a strategic view of how you organize a lot of things in cybersecurity. And I've been asked, can you map this, can you map that? And there are things that the matrix is good at mapping, and there are things that the matrix isn't good at mapping. I'll give you an example of something the matrix isn't necessarily good at mapping. So the first night that I came, someone asked me, can you map Wes Spencer? And I said, well, I'll give that a try. And here, you know, I don't know if I got it right, Wes. Okay. But strategically, I'm not sure if this helps me answer any interesting questions. It might help me understand what drinks to buy you or what, right? But generally, I see Wes as a happy guy, so I figured this would be a, and there's certainly a left of boom, left of drinks, right of drinks, and then a recovery period that he has to deal with, right? So. But anyway, that's it. Again, the matrix doesn't map everything perfectly. It's a strategic 30,000-foot view of the world. And with that, you can do some really amazing things. But if you start going into the tactical detail, it starts to break down. Okay, just be aware of that. And in the conversations that you have with your customers and clients, just recognize that there is a degree to which it no longer becomes as useful when you get down to the tree level. Okay, so I'll let Andrew take a picture there. All right. Okay, so with all these things in the matrix, the question that you might ask is, okay, what problems, do I need to check every box on this matrix? The answer, of course, is no. You don't want to check everything here. But rather, the purpose of the matrix is really to have give you and your customers awareness of the problem space that you're having to deal with, okay? To understand the problem space. When what you see is all there is, you may not understand that there are gaps. The whole purpose of the matrix is to avoid missing those gaps. We don't want to miss gaps in our security posture because, well, that's when the attacker comes and gets us. Those are the things that the attacker finds. Those are the places that we get hurt. So part of the goal then is to understand, well, what should we focus on? What's the priorities? What's number one in this list? What we want to do is be able to declare bingo for our customers and clients. What is the necessary elements that we want to cover to be able to declare bingo? We don't want to oversell, but at the same time, we don't want to undersell either. Now, one way that you guys can prioritize this, of course, is what Andrew mentioned before, and thanks to Phyllis and Curtis and Tony, is the CIS controls. I love the fact that starting with version 7, they have mapped the controls to the cyber defense matrix. I'm not sure if you noticed that, but there is a asset and function in the CIS controls, okay? And so what we have here, in a very blurry format up here, is the mapping of the various controls with the IG, the implementation groups as well. I forget who mentioned it yesterday, but someone was saying the preponderance of the green controls are on the left. There's a few scattering on the right. But you can see that, you can see a distribution of different types of controls and where you have an opportunity to prioritize them. So again, great work from the CIS team. And I especially just like the fact that they mapped it to the matrix as well. That helps make our lives easier as well. Now, even within the context of this prioritization, we have to recognize that various businesses aren't all built the same. And they have their own set of constraints and own set of challenges and things that will basically what I call, will create what I call allergic reactions, okay? Those allergic reactions will prevent you from being able to implement, let's say, I don't know, control 4.2. Well, how would you know that? How would you capture that? And so one of the ways that we can organize information in the cyber defense matrix is to capture those constraints, those allergies. Here's my question to you guys. Let's suppose you have a customer that has a sales and marketing team, okay? Is that unique? No, right? The design pattern to help address their security needs for the sales and marketing team is likely to be the same across from one organization to the next organization to the next organization. If your customer or client has a development team, what are the constraints that they have to work through? They are also likely to be the same as well across different organizations. What if we could actually share these patterns and understand what is the optimal way to design a recipe or some sort of dish, knowing what constraints or knowing what allergies they have? And if we can capture that, we can then optimize and design and provide the security controls that are really well suited for that particular customer or client. Now, I came from Bank of America, where we had all these different types of business functions. I'm sure many SMBs that you guys have don't have as many different functions, but they're not all unique. The combination of these things may end up making them unique, but individually, these different business units are not very unique at all, okay? So what if we can combine, what if we can capture these design patterns, share them amongst each other, and just make our lives easier in saying, here's an optimal way to design a set of security controls to address somebody who's in a call center, or address somebody who's on the road all the time, or address a senior exec that doesn't want you to touch their computer. Anyway, so those sort of design patterns are something, the whole premise behind the cyber defense matrix, it's an organizational system. It's an organizing system that allows you to put information that would otherwise be disparate and put it in ways that helps us then say, okay, here's a control, here's a constraint, here's a technology, here's a capability. They're all in the same box. Let me look at that box with all those different pieces and then make sense of that. Okay, within the context of each of these different business units or business functions, what we also want to do, and this is going to get a little bit more sophisticated, but you'll understand where I'm heading with this. What we want to be able to do is to measure how well we're doing in some of these different areas, and to understand how we're doing relative to the constraints that we have to deal with. Okay, now this is, I'm pretty sure this is probably well past what many of y'all can do, but I'm going to give you a vision of where we want to go, and more importantly, how we can get there quicker. Okay, because I think there's something we can do right away, we as a community, to be able to get to this point that I want to show you. So I want to be able to measure this. I want to be able to say, what does this matrix, these controls that I add in there, what does that mean? And how do I communicate that to my customer? Because adding more controls, I mean, if it's going to cost me money, well, what am I going to get for it, right? But what if I can convey that in the context of some of these quantitative numbers? Like, look, you need to be at a 70, and with these controls, you're at an 80. So you've actually overspent here, okay? this call center, I can do anything I want, which may allow me to get to 100, but I don't really need to. The risk tolerance of the organization says, look, I just need to get to this point, whatever that point is, and I don't want to spend more than that, okay? In other cases, you may say, look, you need to spend more, but it may cause some business impact. Are you willing to suffer the business impact? And there may be reasons why you need to increase the number of controls. It might be because of CMMC. It may be because of some regulatory compliance requirement. But the point here is ultimately to say there is a way that we want to measure how well you are doing as far as your security posture, and to make trade-off decisions that says, I'm willing to suffer business impact, I'm willing to pay for the additional risk reduction, or you know what, I'm willing to risk accept this, and so be it, right? And you want to document that so that they understand what they're signing up for. I offer all this to basically say, we love to have a way to measure this, right? And to be able to put into the matrix a perspective of not defense in depth, but a defense in breadth sort of view. How am I doing across the landscape of opportunities to be able to improve the security controls for a given organization? And to this end, I would love to point you to something that CIS has done as well, called the Controls Assessment Specification. Phyllis, have you told this group about the Controls Assessment Specification? No. All right, great. Well, I don't want to be too much of a spoiler, but I love that they've also not only mapped to the cyber defense matrix, but have put in a set of measurements that you can start using or creating to be able to get to these kinds of numbers, okay? And so the Controls Assessment Specification, that's just search on Control Assessment Specification. Controls, I think controls, yes, plural. And you'll get these measurements. And now these aren't, the numbers you see here aren't the actual measurements. These are the quantity of measurements. So collectively, some of these didn't map into the matrix, but I think there's collectively over 700 measurements captured in the Controls Assessment Specification. And you can see they're distributed as you see, as such. And there's certainly zeros in a couple areas where we don't have any measurements yet. But the opportunity to be able to get a measurement program to understand how you're doing and convey that to your customers, it's there at your fingertips now. Now, granted, there's opportunities to improve this. By all means, there's always opportunities to improve it. And I'm sure the CIS team would love to see some pull requests to suggest changes to this. But it's there and ready for you guys to use. And so I encourage you guys to take a look at the Controls Assessment Specification, see how they're measuring things, and use that to basically provide better information to your customers and clients about how well what their security posture looks like and how they're doing as far as defense and breadth. Okay, now unfortunately, not every measurement here, there's different degrees of I don't want to use the word maturity, but there's different degrees of sophistication when it comes to these measurements. Some of these measurements are easy to do, and some of these measurements are much harder. And that's also another way that I've thought about how we can use the matrix to understand the strength of our measurement program as well. Okay. So, by the way, I'm curious, how many of y'all actually provide any sort of quantitative measurements to your customers and clients? Okay. A handful. And I'm sure there's ways to make it better, right? And so I think the goal here is to find ways that we can collectively improve. As you guys discover ways to make some measurement better, we want to basically say, here's the home for that measurement. And as people struggle or try to find better ways to do things, we have a place where we can go and find that information. Right now, it's oftentimes scattered in a lot of different places. And again, the Cyber Defense Matrix just provides an organizing system to do that. So what am I showing here? When I first looked at the Controls Assessment Specification, I found a lot of measurements that were at different levels of difficulty. And what I wanted to do was basically say to what degree of difficulty or what degree of sophistication are my measurements at today? And I would offer 5, I like the number 5 for whatever reason, 5 levels of difficulty from A through E. where E is the easiest and A is the hardest. E is basically, do I even have the technology? Have I bought the technology? B is, have I deployed the technology? C is, have I turned on the features? So for example, have I bought a firewall? Have I installed the firewall? Is my firewall rules still any, or is it actually blocking anything? Okay. And then B would be performance. Well, how well is it actually doing the job that I expected it to do? And then A is, well, how cost effective is it? Those last two, we would love to have, but we just recognize that's going to be really hard to get. But the first couple measurements should be relatively easy, starting with the first one, have I bought the technology? And I use a timely vaccine metaphor here. Do I have a vaccine? Have I opened the vaccine? Have I started using the vaccine? How well does it perform? How cost effective is it? Okay, so the same concepts apply here. And what we want to be able to do then is collectively understand, what is our measurement program sophistication at today? Are we at a bunch of E's? Do we even have measurements at all? Where do we have gaps? And over time, I would hope that the CAS, I would hope that the controls assessment specification, I would hope that our various programs would go from E to D to C to eventually, we would hope one day, A, to understand really how cost efficient are some of the controls that we're deploying, relative to the cost or relative to how much we're spending, which is another way that you can organize information in the matrix. All right. Another thing I heard this week when I was talking to some of y'all is it seems difficult at times to be able to communicate to the customer, here's when you take over, okay? This is your responsibility, and our responsibility is here. I'm not going to profess to know your market extremely well. I don't at all. But I can make some guesses here. And so if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me. But this is my perception based on the conversations that I had. So there's a set of, first is just to understand that there are different business functions, different business groups tied to each of these different asset classes. And in some of these asset classes, you're going to have some engagement, and in other cases, you're not. For example, in the application space, or specifically the application development space, from what I can gather, most of y'all don't really touch that space at all. That's entirely the business, and you're pretty much hands-off. In other spaces, like on the device space and the network space, I'm presuming that you guys have a lot more direct control. So you can look at this sort of the matrix to be able to say, here's where we're handing off responsibilities to you, or here's where we're picking up the responsibilities. Whether it's in the device space and the network space, you can then draw a line that basically says, we're covering this space up until a certain point, and then when it gets to, in my view, recover, it comes back to the customer, okay? In the application space, it may be all customer, okay? You have essentially the same bar, the bar on the bottom that shows the degree of a responsibility is reflected in each of the rows, okay, but in varying quantities. Can you imagine how that looks? Does that make sense? Okay, and I believe, again, from conversations I've had with a number of y'all, you'll have, for example, a larger number of responsibilities in the device and network space, perhaps none or very minimal in the application space. I'm not sure about the data space. And on the user space, again, it may vary for different, what sort of services you guys offer and what sort of responsibilities you're willing to take on. Now, security in general, so you guys are MSPs. There's also, of course, managed security service providers as well. The way I've always understood MSSPs is that really we're talking about the detect and response space. That's where MSSPs typically operate. And as you guys build out capabilities to offer those kinds of services, again, understanding where the drop-off is, understanding that there's a higher degree of responsibility that you guys hold in operating the detect and respond functions. And at some point, on the response side, again, this is where the customer needs to understand, look, I'm pretty sure you want to have some input into what windows I break and what doors I break down to basically put out some fire that's raging in your house, right? But if you don't give me any input, I'm going to be a firefighter that's just going to break everything to put out that fire. And if that's okay with you, then let's agree to that up front and not try to wrestle with that in the midst of a fire. the opportunity to be able to shape that discussion ahead of time, hopefully the matrix can help you do that as well. I mentioned throughout that the matrix helps us see gaps. And this is, I think this is probably the most powerful aspect of the matrix. The structure helps you see gaps in your program, in the security posture of an organization, in the market. So after Bank of America and before JupiterOne, I also took a one-year stint at a venture capital firm where I had the opportunity to have an investor that would take my harebrained ideas and say, look, we need to find a company that does something in this particular space. Well, how would I know what that something is? So conceptually, imagine, if you will, there's a set of capabilities. The whole universe of capabilities from A through Z could be somehow defined. All right? What you would be able to do is to say, within the function of devices, within the category of devices, let's say there's, again, A is asset management. What I should be able to do is say, if I'm doing asset management, if I'm doing A for devices, then I should do some sort of asset management for applications. I should be doing some sort of asset management for networks. Now, I wouldn't call it necessarily asset management, but it may be something like understanding my communication paths in and out of an environment, to have a data inventory or data catalog, to have a people directory, okay? If I don't have a mechanism to do that, it means I actually have a gap. How do you even know that you got to do this inventory function except that you see it in these other domains? So let's say A, again, is inventory. Well, what's B? B could be prioritization or classification. So A for data is, I want to get a data catalog. B is, I want to classify that data or prioritize that data. Well, how do I do that for my devices? Do I even have something to do that for my devices? Do I have some mechanism to prioritize or classify devices? Do I have some mechanism to prioritize or classify networks? And if there isn't one, then this is a market opportunity for aspiring entrepreneurs. But if you actually do have a capability, or if you find something in the market and the customer doesn't have that, again, it's an opportunity for you to say, hey, you know, this is a gap in your own program. How do you know that's a gap? It's because you have this sort of framework that helps you see those gaps really quickly and easily. All right, so does this make sense? Because this particular one, I think, is probably, I'm not selling it as much as I probably could, but this is probably one of the more interesting aspects of the matrix and a huge opportunity for us to be able to say, there are places that we have no capability whatsoever, or a fledgling capability, which can certainly be expanded to be able to increase business opportunities. Anyway, I'll take questions about this later as well, but just another way to think about how we can use the matrix. Policies. So a friend of mine at Merck gave this. So one of the things that I do every year at RSA is to have a workshop where I ask people who've put the cyber defense matrix into practice to present on a use case that they've come up with. And so this particular person mapped policies to the cyber defense matrix, and she went through and gave this workshop having people walk through mapping policies. So you can map policies. What we'll find, though, is that a lot of policies aren't specific to the asset class, but I can nonetheless figure out what function they're fitting into. What this also helps us understand is where we're missing a policy, right? Do I have a policy for how I respond to devices or how I respond to networks? There's interesting ways that we think about the terminology that might change. For example, incident reporting for a device, we may want to call that something different for incident reporting from a user, which is a whistleblower, right? These concepts carry over, but the words may change depending upon the asset that we're talking about. So again, another way to think about the matrix and organize what seems to be very disparate pieces of information. All right. One other thing that I heard during the conversations yesterday and the day before is where does supply chain map, right? So this is where it gets a little, I hope that you're, well, I'm always a little concerned when I start adding too much information that causes people's heads to blow up. So I have to do this with a little bit of caution, but that said, this was one of the areas that broke my matrix. I was like, I can't seem to put supply chain in here. And the way I had to resolve that is by understanding, well, who is it that owns these assets? When I look at the left column, the assets, devices, applications, networks, data, and users, I had to look at that and say, okay, well, these are assets that I own, I as an enterprise. But I care about assets that are owned by other entities as well. Those other entities include my employees, my customers, my vendors, even assets owned by threat actors. What I had to do then is to create another layer. Okay, I'm really adverse to adding another row or another column, but I'm okay maybe at times to add another dimension. And this other dimension is based on who owns the asset. So when I consider that from that standpoint, then we have this layer where you have assets owned by your third parties or your vendors. And what I'm trying to do in that particular category is I want to do a vendor risk assessment. I want to understand the security posture of a vendor's devices, of a vendor's applications, of a vendor's network, of a vendor's data, and of the vendor's employees or their users, right? That's what you get when you get a security assessment. You're basically you're asked the question, tell me about the security posture of these assets that your vendor owns, or that you own as a vendor, right? Now, there are other cases where I want to leverage a vendor-owned application, better known as SaaS. And what I want to do is I want to extend my security controls into a vendor-owned application. So those would be things like CASB or SSPM. SSPM is SaaS Security Posture Management. And then there's other capabilities out there that also do SaaS detection and response as well. There's other layers, which I won't go into too much, but hopefully that makes sense in terms of how these things are structured. All right? OK. Now, one other thing that Andrew mentioned yesterday, he hinted at, but I think it's important for us to understand what's coming. So I'm going to go through that part real quickly for folks as well, because I think it does hint at what's to come for you guys and what's going to be the big challenge in this current era. So he talked about these different eras. And what I observed when I looked at the matrix and all the different vendors out there was just an obvious gap on the right side. Why are there so few things on the right side over here? And as I thought about that, there were a couple hypotheses I had. One was what you see on the technology spectrum. Maybe if that is true, we should maybe see fewer technologies, right, just in general. But I wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer, and so I studied it further. And I came up with this interesting observation. And it really required me to go back in time and say, what happened over the course of these different eras? So back in the 80s, Dell and Gateway made computers cheap. We bought a bunch of them. The first challenge that we as an organization ran into was, what did I just buy? What business function did it support? And we came up with solutions to address it, things like asset management solutions. I'm going to skip this part for a moment, but basically, in the 80s, there was no security team to address any issues. Fast forward to the 90s, we start seeing viruses. We start seeing people attack our servers and the networks. And we came up with solutions like AV and firewalls. And at this point, the security function was really just vulnerability management. Go find vulnerabilities and try to patch them. 2000s, we're now inundated with logs and alerts. I need tools and solutions to help address that. So we came up with things like IDS and SIEM. And at this point, we need a SOC. We need somebody to maintain eyes on these alerts and to let us know when there's a fire. And then 2010s, I mean, we're fires everywhere. And so we need firefighters and firefighting tools. And at this point, in large enterprises, we have many security organizations break off from the CIO function and become a dedicated business unit with a risk management focus. What I found particularly interesting about these 4 eras of time is that each era mapped to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the 80s, we had an identify problem. The 90s, we had a protect problem. The 2000s, we had a detect problem. And then the 2010s, we had a respond problem. So what does that mean? It means the 2020s, we're going to face a recover problem. Now, what is a recover problem, right? What are the types of attacks that we should see in this current era that basically undermines our ability to recover, undermines your ability to help your organization recover, right? And if I look at it from the context of our traditional DIE Triad, there's one particular type of attack that seems to undermine all of those. And I'm sure you know what that is. right? The 2020s is the age of recover, the age of resiliency. Now, okay, great. We know we should anticipate this, okay? By the way, I had this briefing in 2015, and I presented it at RSA in 2017. So I'm happy and sad that this came true, but it was not too hard to anticipate that the 2020s would be rampant with ransomware and these sort of attacks. But ultimately, if you know what's coming, then we've got to think about what kind of solutions that we need to come up with. And so here's the challenge for us. Your customers and clients are going to be faced with ransomware attacks. They're going to be, actually not just in ransomware attacks, just categorically recover-oriented attacks, okay? How are you going to help them do that? Now, if I went to the marketplace and said, hey, I have a ransomware problem, what can you offer me? What we oftentimes get is things like this. Hey, come join the prevention age. Well, remember, the prevention age was the 1990s, okay? And I think it's super fitting that this particular vendor used the dinosaur to represent this age, okay? By the way, anybody know whose ad this is? Okay, good. Mark, that's a hint. May get upset at me if I made fun of his company. Anyway, so 1990s is the prevention age, but the whole point is that if we're dealing with a 2020 problem, then solutions from the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s isn't going to solve my 2020 problem. Remember, the solutions of the prior era did not solve the problems of the current era. AV did not solve my detection problem. A SIM did not solve my respond problem. We had to have new solutions. We're in the 2020s. We have a ransomware or recover-oriented problem. More protection, detection, and response doesn't actually solve that problem. It may reduce the occurrences, absolutely, but it doesn't actually solve that problem. Make sense? All right, so, okay, great. What do we do? Well, there are solutions out there. They just don't happen to be security solutions. They're actually better designed IT. And as MSPs, I think you have an opportunity to shift this thinking towards how do I design towards better IT approaches, better approaches for how we avoid this problem altogether, okay? And so as I look at the different things out there, it's just things that are been around for a while, like content delivery networks, or design principles like copy on write, Docker containers, serverless functions, all things cloudy cloud, even buzzwords like dictator coin and blockchain. There are all these things that seem to have a attribute of resilience or attribute of being able to help recover. And when I looked at these different solutions, I ended up with 3 core attributes that undergirded all these things. And those 3 attributes are what I call the DIE Triad. DIE stands for distributed, immutable, ephemeral. And these all actually offer really interesting security benefits, but more importantly, it actually offsets our need for CIA, okay? As an example, let's take the ephemerality piece for a moment. Ephemerality offsets the need for confidentiality. So here's my 2-factor tokens. Feel free to take a picture, feel free to post it on Twitter. Do I care about the confidentiality of this information? No, because it's highly ephemeral, right? And so the whole idea here is, what if I can design towards DIE instead of having to CIA everything, okay? We all struggle with security, but the option that we have is, what if we didn't have to deal with security at all? And the opportunity here is for you guys to basically say, hey, customer, hey, client, you're starting to build systems that require CIA. What if we can design them to be DIE instead? And so to give that, to help relay this analogy, or relay that concept, I want to share with you guys this concept of pets and cattle. So if you're familiar with the cloud-native environment, then this is a common term. But the perspective here is that pets are given a familiar name. You take it to the vet when it's sick, and you like giving it hugs. These are things that people care about. These are your personal laptops. This is your social security number. Cattle, on the other hand, you give it some name that you can't even pronounce. When it gets sick, you shoot it and you move on. Okay? And these are things like Docker containers, Lambda functions, credit card numbers that change all the time. Pets, you have the CIA. Cattle, you design the DIE. And the perspective here is, what if you can basically, as an MSP, be not the veterinarian, but the pet control officer? Okay? What if you can offer a pet control function that says, hey, you know what? You guys are about to adopt a whole bunch of new pets. Are you sure you want to do that? Because if you do, guess what? I'm going to raise prices on you as well. What an interesting motivation to reduce the number of pets. Consider, I mean, let's say you're, if you're a veterinarian, of course you love pets, right? But if you're charging them a certain amount for veterinary care, and all of a sudden they have 1,000 pets, your life is going to suck. So what if you can instead, there's a factor around the seats that you pay for, right? But also a factor of how many pets do you have? The more pets you have, the harder your job's going to be, okay? So what we want to do is discourage, or we want to get rid of pets as much as possible, but perhaps more, but it's hard to do that. Like, consider your own pets at home, right? You don't really, it's not trivial just to get rid of a pet. Once you have a pet, it's kind of there forever until it dies, okay? But what if you can instead just avoid new pet creation? What if you can tell your customer, hey, you're about to adopt this pet. Would you like to sign this certificate of adoption? And just know that you have to basically commit to giving it a lifetime of tender, loving care. And by the way, here's your veterinary bill that if you want to adopt this pet, you're going to have to pay. Imagine that you would now have fewer pets, right? And I think that's a really interesting opportunity for us to shift the dynamic from having to secure all the things to having more cattle. That really doesn't matter if it gets compromised because you're just going to shoot it and move on. So it's just a different way of thinking. And so as I go back to the cyber defense matrix, as I look on the right side, I actually have a lot of hope here. It's really dismal, actually, on the left. We are struggling to keep everything on the left side. I mean, all these different tools, all these technologies, all this work that we're doing to secure our customer environments, it's hard work. I think the opportunity for us as we go forward is to really think differently about how we incentivize or de-incentivize new pet creation, and instead focus on how do we encourage our customers to have more cattle instead. A real simple way to think about this, let's say this is something that you should be able to do pretty easily, I think, is to just measure something like uptime. Uptime is something that we've always said, hey, we want high uptime, right? No, actually we don't. The lower uptime you have, the more cattle-like it is. So what if you could actually say, here's my uptime curve, and I'm going to say, you know what, after 40 days, I'm going to declare your asset to be a pet, and I'm going to send you a veterinary bill. What I want to be able to do is to basically say, what if I can drive down to have fewer pets and shorter-lived cattle? And if you can do that, customer, then your bill is lower, or I'm not going to charge you a premium. Okay? The goal here is to encourage customers to use the goal here is to use simple measurements like uptime to basically capture the number of pets that your organization, your customer is starting to adopt, and encourage them to shoot those cattle before they become pets. Otherwise, they get a bill. So with that, I hope that was helpful and instructive. I think I only have 10 more minutes for questions, so I'm going to stop there and open it up for any questions. And remember, 500,000 dictator. Actually, I don't know if I'm committing too much money there. So,
well, as luck would have it, Sounil, you'll check your email later. You're now a dictator coin millionaire.
All right.
So don't spend it all in one place.
I'll try. Okay, you know, let me reduce the price point there. So every slide that I can't answer a question with, I'll give 100,000 dictator coins.
That's 10 questions. We'll see what happens. So I think we've got Ryan Weeks on. Ryan, can we show him on as well? We've got a couple folks lined up for questions. We'll let you guys ask first because you are our guests. And then Ryan, hopefully we'll hear him from the gods.
There we go.
There he is. Ryan, we're going to get your reactions as well. So we'll start right here.
Yeah, thanks a bunch for the framework thoughts. Actually, at the end there, I was wondering the most of kind of a couple examples, like the pets cattle dynamic. Are you talking about VDI versus physical machines? Are you talking about, you know, various extra servers to just reboot? And then when you're saying lack of uptime, well, yeah, if we can't reboot it on a whim, then it's not cattle enough, or what are you?
Yeah, exactly. All those things are spot on. Anything that allows us to shoot it, and that can include just a reboot, right? The fact that you can reboot means you can also have downtime, which means that you can patch it, right? If you need to patch it, which I wouldn't even suggest you do if you can. You just shoot it and rebuild it if you can. Now that's hard in a physical environment, so I get that. But the point that you can even reboot it means that you have the ability as an MSP to patch something, which is great. When the customer says, no, you can't reboot that, you know almost immediately that's a pet. And you need to now treat it with care, which you want to have fewer pets as you consider whatever customer you're trying to embrace. It's easy to also define this notion with like devices and networks and infrastructure. It's a little harder when it comes to data. What are data pets? There's a lot of data pets in our environment, but there's a whole new movement around privacy that makes data pets more like data cattle. And I won't go into too much detail on this one, but that's a whole fascinating space to say, if you have an organization that has lots of data pets, you should be charging more. But if they are embracing things like privacy and using techniques to make that data pet more like data cattle, then that lowers your burden as well as an organization, as an MSP.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
First of all, thank you very much. That was fantastic. A quick question. So with MSSP Alert, over the last 3 years, we've just seen, it's very similar to the cloud industry 10, 15 years ago in that everybody over the last 15 to 18 months to 2 years has been talking about MDR as well as now XDR. It's almost like cloud washing from a decade ago, right? And I know there are actual solutions that work out there, but I am worried in terms of one key question. Who owns response? With the roles of MSPs and MSSPs, we hear about all these solutions in the market, but when an event happens, that response moment, are you seeing better coordination, whether it's between the MSP and the software provider or the MSP and the MSSP? And how do you think that'll play out on the response side? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And so if you recall the matrix, on the response side, it's very people dependent. And the reason why it's people dependent is because of those kind of questions, like who has authority or jurisdiction or ability to action certain things. You can't just, in our IT environments, you can't just blow things away without some sort of business impact that may occur. It is heavily, in my view, heavily people dependent, even if you had a bunch of technologies out there to do the functions of just flipping dials and turning dials and flipping switches. The analogy that I oftentimes use, a really good analogy that you may also be able to use with your customers and clients is, what do you do in a fire, okay? A literal fire, right? You want your fire department to go in and literally break down your doors and whatever. If you want to do that, that's perfectly acceptable if the fire is that bad, okay? But generally speaking, if it's just a little kitchen fire that you can put out with your fire extinguisher, then no, I don't want a fire department to douse my house with all this water, right? It's going to cause a lot more damage than I would want. That sort of discussion and debate and decision making needs to happen before a fire occurs. And the analogy of using a literal fire to say, what would you be willing to have the fire department come and do? At what stages, at what scale of incident would you want to have them do those sort of things? And that helps that discussion. But fundamentally, the point at the end is it's very people dependent. And there's only so much that we should rely on technology to do that function.
Hi, thanks so much for that. There was a really kind of mind-blowing decade-by-decade predictive model in hitting 2020. So are we looping? Are we going to go back to identification being the primary problem? because of sprawl of devices and things like that. And are we on a decade cycle, or is it sort of like a Moore's Law thing where it compresses into like 5 years, 2 years, 3 years?
I'm hopeful that it'd be shorter, but unfortunately, I don't think history has not proven that out. As far as will we start over to identify it, the answer is yes when it comes to new types of digital assets. IoT is an example, right? It's back to the drawing board. How do I inventory those assets? Then later on, we'll figure out how do we protect, detect, respond, recover to those. So every new type of digital asset that emerges, we repeat that cycle, hopefully faster than we did before.
Got a question over here. I think this is Patrick, right? We have not met yet, but this is ConnectWise's new CISO. Welcome to the team.
Hey, Patrick, it wasn't me. I wasn't the insider.
So for the record, when Sounil got in trouble, I was running the Global Insider Threat Group, and I was actually watching your computer the whole time to make sure. No, I'm joking. Actually not, but.
My job at Bank of America was to try to get fired every day.
We shared an office, and we had some good times. But on the cow, yeah, I love it, by the way, and it's a lot of it resonates for some of the stuff we were doing a long time ago. Cow roadmap, right? It's not esoteric, but it's a big place to get to, right? Especially technology-wise. I mean, with MSPs, it's a lot of different maturity levels. It's considering, and this is more just a question for you, and maybe for the next time, is to talk about maybe diving into that and saying where is the roadmap to get to that, because that can be kind of hard for a lot of the folks to be able to kind of wrap their heads around. Geez, how the heck do I do that? So.
The future's unevenly, well, the future's here, it's unevenly distributed. There are organizations that are more cloud native that have figured out how to build things more cattle-like. And as we learn from those patterns that they share with us, we learn how to do that better ourselves. The unfortunate aspect is that many of us have a lot of legacy assets. What are legacy assets? They're pets. Can you get rid of legacy assets easily? No. So if you can't get rid of them, then let's at least stop the tide of new ones, or at least control that, right? It's going to be hard to get rid of those. We just recognize that they're going to exist in perpetuity until someone chooses to let them go, or it falls over on its own. But we as a security function, we as an MSP, we should do as much as we can to help the customer not adopt new pets accidentally or unknowingly. That's the easiest thing that we can do.
So assuming we get to utopia and we have a world of cattle, we've reached a utopia, what do you predict is next?
Oh, well, first of all, I think we'll always have pets. We just don't want as many as we have today. So yeah, every organization will always have some number of pets. We just want the number of them to be as few as possible. I'll give you a quick analogy. Our body, so what's the longest lived cell in your body? Not close, not quite. Anybody? Longest lived cell in your body? Your brain cells. Shortest lived? Skin, okay. Or blood cells, skin cells. But things that, you know what, if a skin cell dies, you don't really care. You do care if your brain cells die. Every organization will have some number of brain cells, hopefully lots of skin, cattle-like cells. You will always have pets. If you have a pet, like your brains, you want to protect it and make sure that you know that needs to be protected. What's the ratio of brain cells to skin cells? Anyway? It's like 0.0001%. It's some really, really small number, okay? So every organization will have pets. You just want to have as few as possible. I think many organizations, unfortunately, will say, you know what, 30% of our environment is pets. That is an unsustainable, high risk. If you wanted to insure somebody for that, you should charge them a huge premium because they have so many pets. What does the future look like? The future looks like just, I hope, fewer and fewer pets overall. Pets that you can manage because you don't have to run around worrying about all these pets that are running off in the street and getting run over. I think that's what the future holds for us.
Thank you.
Since we're always going to have pets, is there any way to make an inside dog an outside dog, for instance, so it requires a little bit less care and feeding?
Yeah. Okay, so I have this analogy here too with pets and cattle. So cattle is like the cloud. It's the outside, okay? Pets are on-prem, cattle in the cloud. Pets on-prem, cattle in the cloud. It's okay to feed your cattle to your pets. It's not okay to feed your pets to your cattle, okay? So what happens when you put your pets in the cloud, which is what a lot of people used to do, lift and shift and drop them into the cloud. What happens shortly afterwards? You know the rest of the story there, right? That pet gets compromised and people have a bad day. You can't just lift and shift. You have to redesign that pet to make it more cloud native, to operate in such an environment that is meant to be more cattle-like. Now, if you take that pet and stick him outside, you're going to have to shield that pet. You're going to have to give it lots of countermeasures, a lot of controls, lots of ways to ensure that that pet doesn't get run over and compromised. Yeah, so there are ways, but you're starting with this premise of indefensible infrastructure. So is it worth spending all this money, putting all these countermeasures on a pet that you're trying to put into the cloud? Or is it better to just redesign it from the beginning?
Hey, Sounil. You mentioned that you work for a venture firm, and I would be interested in your perspective as you look around at the solutions here and solutions for managed service providers. Well, my understanding is you put together a cybersecurity suite, and that's what you kind of are expert at. And it would be really interesting, and I'd be willing to pay you, to see if you could figure out something that would really be centralized or streamlined, or I guess with your experience, the question would be, could you put together a cyber suite that would be rock solid, awesome, and affordable for managed service providers? Do you think you could do it? And if so, how much capital would it take? You got to answer it right now.
1 billion. Anyway, so what I really like about the Matrix and what I really like about the MSP community that I didn't realize until I had a chance to meet some of y'all like many months ago is, so I'm an investor in SaaS alerts. And when I first saw that, I'm like, how is this? I mean, we've solved this problem already. Like, what's magical about this? Until I understood the MSP environment and I realized, oh, wow, that's an interesting challenge that you guys have. And I can see how something that someone's already found and figured out how to solve is something that you can easily turn into an MSP type, a product that works for MSPs, okay? If you remember that chart that had the A through Z, all right? So I have that was a conceptual chart, but I have a much more detailed understanding of, oh, here are all the different features and capabilities for every kind of security capability I would want if I were to have a complete set. And each one of those, there are some, or not each one of them, some of them there are commercial capabilities for, and others there are not. But nonetheless, it's a copy and paste activity to take those capabilities and say, how do I adapt this to the MSP market? Which isn't trivial, but nonetheless, a lot of the hard work of figuring out how to do it, of actually what the capability is, has been done. And I think that's great. It's just now a matter of picking and choosing and saying which ones are going to give me the most market opportunity. So I think this market is really, really ripe because SMBs need help. The solutions and the way that you solve the problem is known. We just got to take it from something that's very complicated to something that's super simple. And that process, that roadmap is a lot easier than going from something that we don't even know the answer for to coming up with a solution.
So an add-on question to that, standards. So there's a lot of solutions and they don't talk to each other. And nor is there an incentive for them to talk to each other. In fact, there's a disincentive for them to interoperate and to intercommunicate. Do you see a way past that? Mm-hmm. And if so, what?
Yeah, so this is where actually the matrix also comes in. Each of the boxes, I had an effort a while back. It's met with modest success or failure. But the idea was, what if we can have each of those boxes have a defined set of inputs and outputs, such that we as an industry can say, here's the set that goes into us, and here's the set that goes out to us that will point to the next box or the next set of functions. What's really fascinating to me is that the pattern that we see for devices fits the same pattern that we would see for applications, fits the same patterns that we would see for networks, and so on and so forth. So these standards that we may create for the inputs and outputs, the higher level pattern actually follows and continues and makes the job easier for us to see what the inputs and outputs could be. Now, it's going to be up to us as a community to basically drive vendors to adhere to these standards. But the biggest challenge that we've had is just not knowing how these things are connected together. Think of these as Lego pieces, right? The matrix as a way to think about Lego pieces. Once we know how those pieces fit together, the job becomes much easier for us to then define either de facto or full set of standards to make those a lot more interoperable. But today, unfortunately, it's not. One other analogy I would offer is I use a grocery store analogy oftentimes when I describe the cyber defense matrix. How do I know that bananas and blueberries go together? I don't know if they do. But how do I know that? And you don't really know until someone experiments and tries that. And someone says, hey, this combination sounds great. What I really want the cyber defense matrix to be a home for is those combinations, those recipes, where we discover, hey, this capability interoperates well with this capability. Not this vendor, but rather this capability with this capability. They pair together extremely well. Let's capture that so that no one else has to discover that again. And where do we put it? Where's the home for that? That would be something like the cyber defense matrix.
So like an example of that might be a password system handing off passwords to a vulnerability scanner that could then authenticate into the server or workstation and truly check for vulnerabilities and come back with a much more accurate report would probably make that alone 50% more valuable. So, that's already kind of known. So like how would you get that out there? I guess I'm trying to say, if the internet would be nothing if it wasn't interoperable.
Yes.
Right? And so this cybersecurity defense, shell has cracks everywhere because there's no interoperability. And if you've got cracks everywhere, you really don't have a front wall defense. Sorry.
Yeah, so let me offer a different way to frame what you just said. So how do you know that salt enhances flavor? We don't until you experiment, right? I don't have an interoperability model with salt and food per se, unless you go into molecular astronomy, which is a whole different topic. But the perspective I would offer is, if you recall that measurement sophistication chart that I gave earlier, what is it that how would the passwords improve my ability to extend coverage, extend efficiency or effectiveness, extend some performance facet? So what will happen is, if I use a password vault, if I can integrate with a password vault, my vulnerability scanner, its effectiveness or its performance, I forget which one it is, increases by some margin, right? So now I have a way to describe what is the value of this additional combination. And can we describe those in ways that it can be genericized so that I can say, this is where the contribution is, okay? As opposed to saying, well, at some point, someone's going to discover and say, password vault plus Tenable ends up with goodness, right? Peanut butter and chocolate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We've got one more. Let's get to Ryan real quick, and then we'll get to your question as well. Ryan?
Yeah, so that was phenomenal. I actually bought your book in the middle of the talk, by the way. So there are 5 takeaways that I had from that I just wanted to re-highlight for everyone. We've talked about on the cyber call control effectiveness. Sounil just gave you a great resource in the CIS control specifications for that. And when I talk about control effectiveness, he gave you a 5-letter model for thinking about control effectiveness, the A through E, or E through A rather. That is something that I think you absolutely need to do. We talk a lot about before you add new capabilities, you need to understand how well the existing capabilities you have are operating. Thinking about it in terms of that grade, that grade letter scale, you probably shouldn't buy a net new piece of technology or deploy a new capability unless you're sure the existing controls you have are operating well. So that letter scale gives you a really good opportunity. I love the age of recovery and resiliency talk track. Obviously, cyber resilience is very near and dear to my heart, but if you look at the rate of success of ransomware, it would indicate that while we are in the age of recovery and resiliency, we have not yet mastered resiliency. And so we're going to talk about that this afternoon in the BCDR at Scale talk. I want to go back to Joe P's question on who owns response. I want you to think about that question as an MSP, because I think it's a really important question. I want you to think about it in the context of a RACI matrix. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed when it comes to response to a boom event. Especially if you have co-managed solutions, whether it's vendor, whether it's MSSP, whether it's co-managed with on-prem IT, being really clear about that RACI matrix for response activities is going to be pivotal, because otherwise, when you're in the middle of a response, you're not going to know who's supposed to be doing what, and you're going to be losing precious time. Every minute, every hour that goes by is more damage and financial loss to you and your customers. So really important question there. And then I think, Sunil's talk kind of pulled all of yesterday together. And one of the things, I think you can think of is, so you're thinking about the CIA versus DIE models in terms of how do I move my business from CIA, from pets, to cattle, DIE. Another talk you had yesterday, which was how do you address your vendors and their security? One of your questions for your vendors should be, what are you doing to move towards a DIE model? How is your architecture? You're deploying me a piece of software that sits in my environment. You expect it to live on a server that's more like a pet than a piece of cattle. How can I operate your software in a mode that is more DIE? What are you doing to move your SaaS application that I use towards a DIE model? Those are ultimately going to be important conversations to have as well. So, I mean, there's tons more stuff that came up for me, but those were kind of 5 aha moments that I just wanted to re-highlight for everyone.
Let me add one thing real quickly on that last point. On-premise exchange, pet. Please get your customers off of pets. There's an easy opportunity to get them on the cattle, Office 365. If your business model requires them to remain on pets, you are doing them a disservice.
Sounil, thank you. This has been fantastic.